Hello, good evening, and today I'm going to compare two albums from 1980, John and Yoko's Double Fantasy, which came out 17th November 1980, versus McCartney II, which came out actually 6 months before, 16th of May 1980, so not that close. But this will be the last year when, unfortunately, when we could compare two releases from John and Paul. No albums from Ringo or George in that year, and we lost John, as we know, 3 weeks after this album came out. This is a German pressing with the slightly different back sleeve here. Great picture taken outside the Dakota. And the front cover. Well, I'll be honest with you, what I thought of them at the time, and then obviously hindsight has produced a different perspective. You know, after losing John, Double Fantasy became very emotional to talk about, really, because of the loss we had from him, and who knows what he would have gone on to do. But it's interesting to hear and to read that coming up the single from McCartney II, Lennon heard it and kind of partly inspired him to return to the studio, which is always pleasing, because, you know, one hears stories about John doesn't like Paul's music and vice versa, and so you hear things like that. It was in Fred Seaman's book, I think, and yeah, quite heartwarming to think that he was moved by Paul's music to make a comeback, because I remember I got into the Beatles in 1978 and I was very frustrated that he wasn't producing music. All kinds of rumours at the time about what he was doing, and, you know, was he Howard Hughes sitting in the Dakota with a long beard doing nothing? All kinds of stories. Anyway, I'll start off with McCartney II. So this was, the first thing to say is, the first surprise was it was not a Wings album, because Wings hadn't officially split up at this stage. I think what happened is Back to the Egg didn't do very well commercially, and he put out Wonderful Christmas Time as a solo artist with Wings in the video, and it got to number 6 in the UK. And he thought, well, there's an idea, maybe I should go solo. But actually this is the new vinyl, by the way. It was recorded in the summer of '79, round about the same time as when Back to the Egg came out. So he put it out. Didn't take him long he didn't fuss over this album. There's not much production on it. It's quite a bare production. But, I mean, at the time, I seem to remember the reviews were mixed. You know, Enemy and people were probably slagging it off, they always do. But I seem to remember reading a couple of good reviews of Coming Up and Waterfalls, the singles. The album itself, I remember someone saying Tale of Two Ditties. I think it was Carr and Tyler, actually. Remember Tim Rice being on the radio, kind of trying to defend the album, saying, well, there's some good tracks on it, like One of These Days. But I don't think he was overly impressed. And in terms of songwriting, it's not a brilliant album, but it does have a very unpretentious quality, and it's quite a good album to come back to, because it's, as I say, it's unpretentious, a little bit thin production-wise, but it's a solo effort, and it was 10 years since the first McCartney album, which was also a solo effort, so interesting kind of bookends to the 70s, that he came out with 2 solo albums at the beginning and at the end. One of These Days, I think, is easily the best track on the album. I think that's kind of a standard for McCartney, although he's never done it in concert for some reason. I'm still a little bit, I get annoyed with Temporary Secretary. He performed that in concert a few years ago. It seems to have undergone a renaissance, and people think the whole album is quite experimental and avant-garde, or I don't like to use that word, but adventurous. Whereas they thought, well, the general opinion at the time of late Wings is London Town and Back to the Egg were a bit pedestrian, which I don't agree with. But it does have a nice quality to it, and I know a lot of you guys out there rate this album. I think On the Way is a very moody, good track, although B.B. King did a pretty awful version of it on the Art of McCartney just before he died. Waterfalls, beautiful tune and quite an interesting video, but lyrically a little bit soft. Nobody Knows has always been one of my favourite tracks, closing side one, and then we got side two, which is not that strong really. I mean, there's a couple of instrumentals which are quite interesting. I don't dislike them. I just one has to be in the mood for this album. Summer Day Song could have also been an instrumental. He added a verse at the end, I think. Nice, really nice tune. And then we got Bogey Music, which is a bit dismissible. Dark Room, which is quite interesting, but not a heavyweight song. But One of These Days closes the album in very strong style. It's a beautiful gatefold picture, by the way, taken by Linda, I think. And Frozen Jap, a little bit provocatively named because he'd been busted in Japan in January of this year, and this album came out in May, so that was probably a reference to that. I'll be honest with you, when Double Fantasy came out, I remember feeling cheated that 7 songs of John, 7 of Yoko, after 5 years of nothing. Why does he have to share the album with Yoko? We only get 7 new songs from John, although the Yoko songs are among the best of her career. One still feels could have put out a double or something, or maybe separate albums, but that's not the point. And as I say, as I've grown older, I've grown to appreciate Double Fantasy for what it was, quite a mature record describing a relationship which is trying to work, and with the ups and downs, not necessarily saying it's all rosy. Tracks like I'm Moving On, Give Me Something from Yoko, are pretty negative, and I'm Losing You from John. So, but having said that, when, after 5 years, there was bound to be some classic Lennon tracks on here, and Watching the Wheels, Woman, and I'm Losing You are the best 3. And they're better than anything on this album, in my opinion, those 3 tracks. Starting Over, and I remember crowding around the radio listening to the single when it first was played on the radio and being a little bit underwhelmed by it. I was a bit annoyed by the production, the backing vocalists, those female backing vocalists. A bit reminiscent of the backing vocalists on Mind Games. There's something different, chorus. But the stripped down version, which Jack Douglas and Yoko put out a few years ago, I think is a much better version, much raunchier version of this track. I don't think it needs the backing vocals. The horns, it's well arranged. And also, and I'm a bit embarrassed to admit this, I remember being a bit underwhelmed by Beautiful Boy at the time, thinking it's a little bit soppy. But then we lost him. And you hear that track and it's very emotional. I mean, and Sean was only 5 and he lost his dad, so what can you say? Clean Up Time and Dear Yoko were pretty good tracks. And very interestingly, in November 1980, there's an interview on US TV which Paul does from his Sussex home, live by satellite, where he's asked about some John Lennon comments I think it was in the Playboy interview, where he's saying The Long and Winding Road was the last gasp from McCartney, and Paul says, I don't know why John says things like that, and I think the best method is not to comment. It's a funny one, and I don't think I've had my last gasp. And one just wishes that that was only 3 weeks before John died, or 2 weeks before he died, I think. Just one wishes they could have buried the hatchet completely and completely made up. I think they were on a lot better terms. He used to speak on the phone. But, you take a Lennon quote like that out of context and it sounds awful. Because Paul certainly did some great stuff after the Beatles, there's no question, and I think John would acknowledge that. So I don't know why he said last gasp. He went through a bit of a spurt before the Beatles split with Let It Be, Long and Winding Road and stuff, and then he said those famous words, "the last gasp," and that's gone down in history. So it's a bit unfortunate. But as I say, I felt cheated at the time, and now I'm just happy to have it. And Milk and Honey was interesting, although I'm not sure if some of those tracks would have made it had Lennon lived, and I'm not sure if they were strong enough, like I'm Stepping Out and stuff. And nobody told me he was going to give to Ringo. But the future was looking very, very bright for John and Yoko, and they would have come to England and toured in '81. It was not to be, but interesting albums from John and Paul in 1980, and happy to have them both. They both had their moments. I'm not going to pick a winner. This is not really a head-to-head. One of the comments on my review earlier said, "Why do you have to choose one over the other?" Well, I'm not going to choose one over the other. I think they're both important parts of each one's catalogue, and I'll leave it at that. And I come back to them pretty often, and I'd just like to compliment Jack Douglas on his superb production along with John and Yoko on this album, and the superb musicianship from Earl Slick, Hugh McCracken, Tony Levin, George Small, Andy Newmark. Probably the best band that Lennon assembled in his lifetime, in my opinion, whereas this one is very, very much the opposite. Just a solo effort. Great cover, by the way. Good back cover. So that's John and Paul from 1980, the last time we would be able to have two albums from those two, unfortunately. Thanks for watching. See you next time.